What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. Today I want to cover something even a little bit different than what we've been talking about lately in terms of wish lists for Madden 22 and things like that. And I actually want to talk today about my number one issue with Madden franchise mode outside of the lack of depth and content within the game, which I think is most people's number one gripe with franchise mode. I want to talk about something that is even more far-reaching, even as far-reaching, I guess I could say, and as problematic as just the general lack of depth to the game mode and lack of content within the game mode. And that is going to be the long-term problems that Madden franchise mode has. And I want to talk a little bit first here about why it's a problem to have long-term issues with franchise mode, to have these types of issues with franchise mode. And specifically, the issue I'm talking about is just the basically the best way to describe it is the lack of balance within a long-term franchise mode. As you go further and further into a franchise mode, it's impossible to not have every single team be a super team. And the thing that you have to understand is that this franchise that I'm in here, as I scroll through some of the rosters, is a heavily edited franchise. Every single season we go through and downgrade bottom performers and stuff like that and try to balance out the league ourselves, and it's still a majority of the teams are way higher overall than they probably should be. Even the CPU teams are way better than they should be at this point in a franchise. And that causes a lot of long-term problems. It causes so many problems, and it stems from a combination of different issues. What I want to get into is, some of the issues that are caused by this and some of the things that are causing the issues. And so we've already talked about how in Madden, in long-term franchises, which is what I like to do in Madden, I like to get into a franchise and I like to carry that franchise forward for like 10 plus years. That's what's fun to me. Building a team, seeing that team go through its cycles of winning and losing and contention and regrowth, rebuilding, all of that. That's what's fun, managing a franchise the way an NFL team has to. And being able to simulate forward and play forward is a huge thing for a franchise mode. That's what you want to be able to do with the team. That's kind of the goal of managing a franchise and playing a franchise mode, is to play into the future, play future years, see what's going to happen in the future, achieve things that aren't currently possible for the team that you're taking over. And so you guys can see up at the top, we're in 2025. And like I said, you have to consider the fact that this franchise every single year is heavily edited. At the end of the season, I readjust the roster to try to balance things out and make things more competitive. Well, one of the things that I want to say is I just took over this Miami Dolphins team a season or two ago, and this team already went from an 80 overall to essentially an 89 overall team, and that's a huge problem. It's too easy, and this goes for user teams and CPU teams. It is way too easy for teams to become super powered and OP teams and super high overalls within the game whenever you stretch into a further position in a franchise. And so let me get into some of the issues that that reaches to, and some of the issues that are causing that. And the number one issue that causes is it causes a complete lack of balance, and it also causes it to be too easy to create a super team at a late stage in a franchise. As you guys can see, we're only 5-6 years into this franchise, starting at the beginning of Madden 21 whenever it came out, and I'm already able to hop over to a team and build them up to an 89 overall within a season, within 2 seasons. And the reason for that is because of the lack of balance within the other areas of the game, the lack of depth within the franchise mode. And so what are some of the issues that are causing this? What are some of the things that are fixable that could prevent this from happening in a long-term franchise, prevent things like this from becoming an issue? And so some of the things that are causing this is, number one, the AI isn't very smart. They're not smart with how they manage their teams. They're not smart with how they manage their contracts. They're not smart with how they draft players or how they sign free agents or re-sign players. Those are all huge problems, and that in itself, fixing the AI to be smarter, to learn to hang on to certain players, not set them out to free agency, to be smarter in who they draft and the positions that they draft, is that that type of thing, a smarter AI. And I see somebody commented the main reason there is that there's no contract disputes. That's a great reason. The contract system, and I was going to get into that a little bit more, but I can hit on that now. The contract system is a huge thing that contributes to this. The inability to have contract disputes, the inability to have a realistic contract system, and for user teams, the ability to sign guys to way cheaper contracts than they realistically should have. Signing guys to way less money than that they're realistically worth. We shouldn't have guys that are super high overalls making well below what they're actually worth, and it's too easy to do this within the game, and it creates so many problems. It just creates these long-term problems where all of these teams are super OP. Now, outside of that, outside of, talking about the AI being, dumb and talking about the contracts, the other things that cause this issue is that the regression system in the game is absolutely atrocious. And I know that they've worked to improve some of these things. And as I go through this list, they have certainly worked to improve a few of the topics that I'm talking about, but they haven't done enough to make a long-term franchise feasible without putting in a whole bunch of extra work where I have to edit the roster, or you have to edit your roster at the end of every single season. So one of the issues, like I said, is going to be the lack of regression within the game. And they have changed regression to where you can now hit regression at the age of 28. But the problem is they don't understand, EA doesn't understand that players can increase and decrease in terms of their production and their in-game ability for so many different factors. Whenever a player suffers a big-time injury, that drops off their ability to perform. It drops their athleticism in real life. And so, you should see things like a reduction in overall coming back from a major injury and things like that. In addition to that, I think that you guys should see, players that just simply don't perform should regress on their own. Just because a player's 25 years old doesn't mean they should just automatically maintain their overall. If I look at my roster, for example, and I look at one of the best players, let's say I take a look at my 90 overall halfback. This guy's young. I understand he's a superstar. He's 22 years old. But if he gains 300 yards in 16 games played, why should this guy stay as a superstar 90 overall player? It's impossible for his rating to go down based on his performance. He can now lose dev trait, which is fantastic that they added that into the game. The system still needs a lot of work, but he can't lose overall based on that. And the thing that you have to think about, and I've addressed this in other videos in terms of tips to help with your immersion in your franchises, is every single year the game comes out, they edit the roster, and players that didn't perform well get edited down in terms of their overall. So why at the end of each season in a franchise isn't the same logic applied? Because realistically, the end of each season in a franchise is the same as a new Madden game coming out, and so the entire roster should be evaluated, and there should be a system within the game that does it itself. It should evaluate the players based on their performance, based on how many games they've played, and based on the other factors that are compiled into that, and determine an overall for that player and what that player should be. Now, I'm not saying we have to get absolutely wild with it. I'm not saying we have to start nuking players left and right, but you're going to end up with these 90 overall teams across the league if you have no form of true regression until a player hits the age of 30. I mean, that's a huge problem. And then the next one that I already saw somebody comment down below is, we want to talk about the draft. The draft is a huge problem, and it creates so many far-reaching issues for the franchise. Number one is teams don't draft right. Number two, the auto-generated players in terms of their overall, their ratings are horrible. There are way too many players that have unbalanced stats. There are way too many players that come in maybe higher overall than they should, lower overall than they should, and realistically this goes back to the CPU's logic in drafting certain players and then not starting them. It doesn't recognize that a player is a super young player and should be taking over for that team and playing ranking above the players that are ahead of them. And so if you're not vigilant as a commissioner of a league, or if you're not vigilant as a member of a league, and you're not going in and checking to make sure all of the rookies that are coming in, especially the early first round picks, if you're not making sure that they're starting and you're wiping out the players that are ahead of them, you can have a league that really stagnates in terms of their rookies and allows the higher overall players to just get insanely high overall, and then the teams become OP. It becomes a huge problem. And so the draft is another thing, and that is something that's fixable. I understand that the CPU AI, the CPU logic is going to be something that is harder to gauge. It's going to be a complex issue for them to address, and I'm not expecting them to address that all at once. But if they could address the way teams draft, if they could address the way teams sign and negotiate contracts, the way that teams hold on to players, the way that teams sign players, that would make a huge difference in terms of their actual ability to have a balance within a long-term franchise mode. Now, the last couple things that I want to talk about is essentially the progression system, which is the opposite of what I've already talked about in terms of the regression system, and then the dev traits. And I've already talked about this in the last one, the video, my first wish list video, and that's the dev traits and the problems that it causes with the progression system. Having so many high development players is a huge problem. It allows these things to happen. You guys can see I took over this team, and all I needed to do was get a bunch of star and superstar players and force feed them the ball, and therefore my players were able to get into super high overall positions. This team's an 80 overall within a season or two. It's way too easy to do that, and realistically speaking, they did actually add an option to address this within the sliders. But one thing that I have to say about this is, yeah, it's nice, within the settings, it is nice that they added a setting in to be able to adjust how many superstars, how many stars, how many X factors are within the game. That's great that they added this in, but we should not be the ones that have to find that balance. I shouldn't have to be 5 years into a franchise figuring out what the right balance is between how many X factors, how many superstars, and how many stars we should have. This should be set by the game, and there should be algorithms going on behind the scenes to say, oh wait, we have too many teams getting to a high overall, let's reduce how many players are out there with super good development traits. And therefore, they should also consider the regression of those players. Oh wait, we have every single team in the league above a 90 overall, maybe we should consider regressing some of these players and balancing some things out. But, I don't think that some of those things would be super complicated. Not as complicated as fixing the CPU logic. That is something that I think would be super easy for them to add into the game, because they already have a regression system. They already have a progression system. They need to tone down the progression system. They need to tone down the amount of XP that players get. They need to tone down the ability for you to, burst a guy's rating because of force feeding him the ball or using glitch blitzes and stuff to get a certain player sacks or something like that. They need to tone down on those things, and that shouldn't be hard to do. And once they do that, you will see a better balance within long-term franchises, and you'll see a better essentially rating system between all of these teams. And just to highlight this one more time before we cut off the video, I already talked about how we in this league edit every single year, but look at some of these teams. 88 overall for the Steelers, 81 for the Seahawks, 83 for the Saints. everybody's above an 80 here, and I've edited most of these teams down from high 80 overalls. Literally the only team I think that's in here that is below a 80 overall is the Kansas City Chiefs at this point, because they don't have the salary cap to sign anybody. Whenever you start off in Madden, you have at least 2 or 3 teams that are like a 75 overall, because they understand that the teams with the worst records in the league, or the teams that are devoid of talent, are going to be a low overall. But why isn't that balance there? Why isn't there systems in place to prevent this type of thing from happening? And like I said, we've edited a lot of these teams down, so these ratings are appearing lower than you would see them 5 years into a franchise, especially if you have more users. You have to consider this is a league with like 4 users in it. Imagine a league that has a bunch of users, or a league that has all users. You end up with every team being a superstar, blown up, OP team that has X factors running all over the field. I guess I should apologize. There's 279 overall teams. But, you know, literally every team in here, and some of the CPU teams are just crazy OP. And that's a problem for long-term franchise. And I'm sure you guys have seen this issue as well. But I just wanted to make a video kind of ranting about it, giving my opinion about it, and getting out some of my suggestions for it, because there are some things here that, in my opinion, shouldn't be that hard to put into the game. You know, a better regression system, a slowed down progression system, those shouldn't be hard to put into the game. Better CPU logic, that might be more complex, you know. Maybe fix the contract system. You know, maybe make it so that you fix certain aspects of the CPU logic, fix some of the drafting aspects of things, and that would get us to a point where long-term franchises are more feasible and more balanced. And so I'm going to end the rant there. You know, I know that I saw some of your comments down in the comment section below, and I agree with most of you guys as well, and you guys kind of agree on the subject. So, you know, hopefully you guys will like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of this type of stuff, you know, where we put these videos out daily. Comment down below with anything you guys would like to see next, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Be on the lookout for my future videos. I have a lot planned. See ya.